First of all, I just want to say super happy that you're doing this with me. For those that do know my book and that know the interview series Make Work Better, in chapter six, and matter of fact, it starts on page 99 for those that are wondering. I start quoting you, Tim, for your book, The Only Leaders Worth Following. So this is a dream come true for me. I think I'm now maybe I've got three people that I've quoted and have mentioned in the recommended reading section of my book that I've had on the show and have gotten to talk shop a little bit. So this is an absolute thrill for me. But just for those that don't know, because honestly, until another friend, a mutual friend of ours, recommended your book, I hadn't heard of you. And then when I read the book, I thought, man, I'm so glad I read this book, and I got to get to know you more. But just high level, tell us more about who you are.
Yeah, well, my start into the leadership development space happened about 22 years ago. I was getting ready to go to graduate school, and I had a colleague, a fellow server at the restaurant where I was waiting tables, invite me to an open house for a marketing company. And I thought, marketing was going to be one of my points of emphasis in getting my MBA in grad school. And I was fairly certain there'd be a free meal involved, and that was pretty important at that time of life. So I was all in. I took a seat in the middle of the room because that was the only thing that was left. It turned out to be a really big part of the story because I found out about 3 minutes in what an open house for a marketing company actually is. Perhaps I should have asked a few more questions, but I discovered that I had been invited to a recruiting meeting for a multi level marketing organization. And I'm not categorically against those organizations. I know they've blessed lots of people, but I had no desire to sell water purifiers to my family and friends. So in that moment, 22 years ago, I had a decision to make. Am I going to make a scene and shimmy my way out of this seat and out of this room? Or am I going to hang around for the break and grab a sandwich and head out the door? And so, in the end, I suppose probably influenced by my folks teaching me to be polite, I thought I'll just wait it out here. And I'm so glad that I did because what happened after that initial realization of what was going on is they started talking about what does it mean to be an employee. And in that moment, the dark cloud of doom and gloom entered from the back of the room. There was weeping and gnashing of teeth. It was awful. And I will tell you, in that moment, I checked out. I didn't hear another thing in the presentation. The person up front became like Charlie Brown's teacher to me. And I just sat there and thought, why is being led such a terrible experience for so many people? And I left the room I left at the break as I had planned. But as I walked to my car, I remember it like it was yesterday. As I walked to my car in the parking lot, I decided in that moment that I was going to start to very intentionally study leadership. And so the next day, I started calling leaders that I had access to that I respected. I had a few really unsophisticated ideas of my own, but I just started talking with people. And I'd say the same thing at the end of every discussion. Who else should I talk to? And they'd give me three names, and I would call those people, and then they would give me three names. And that started 22 years ago, and essentially in different forms has not stopped since. So that's how I got started in this work. That's how the passion was lit for me, and it hasn't stopped yet.
It's amazing to see some of the points of connection too, because as you're telling that story, I lived that story too. For me, it was 24 years ago, and it was on Stemmons Freeway in Dallas, Texas, where I was responding. I was given a time to come in for a job interview, and it was me and about 40 other people. I was like, oh, "What? You're bringing us all in to interview us to get?" Like, I had no idea what I was getting into, and yes, it was a water
Oh,
purifier
okay.
kind of
We
thing.
could have been we could have been colleagues, Will.
So, but it's funny that I had some of the same thoughts too, and which are wow, we really seem to have a leadership deficit. Now, the funny story is, I ended up going on to work for a company for about 2 years. That the 2 years I was at this particular company, it was both kind of, it taught me a lot of really, really good things I was able to take to other points of my career. And then it taught me what not to
Mhm.
do and what I, 23 years later, I've been railing against ever since. So yeah, that's interesting. So tell me more about. So you're part of a company called the
Mhm.
Aperio. I assume I'm
Yep, you
pronouncing
got
that
it. Yep.
correctly. How did that come to be, and what do you specialize in there?
Yeah, so 11 years ago, I made the choice to launch this thing. And I am not I'm not the kid that had the lemonade stand. I haven't sat in my cubicle my whole life dreaming of the day when I owned the company and could call my own shots and all those kinds of things. Basically, I was feeling about starting this company similarly to the idea of writing the book, which came a little bit later on, which is at some level, I can't not. And it wasn't because I was so aspirational as an entrepreneur. It's because at every stop in my work in leadership development as a consultant and with organizations, there was always a governor somewhere. There was always a limit on what I could say or who I could say it to. And I just said to myself, self, I've got to get into an environment where I can just speak freely. And if it fails, it fails. But I've got to give it a shot because I want to find space to talk freely about the research that I've been a part of, the things that I've seen. And so 11 years ago was the time to make that leap. And thankfully, to this point, we're 11 years in. I don't see any end in sight, God willing. And it's been really fun to not have those limitations, to be able to just say the truth as I understand it based on research and then let the chips fall where they may. And if that, I don't want to be offensive, but sometimes people get offended. Sometimes people don't like it. And, my response is I'm reporting. I'm not inventing. I'm reporting what the data says. And to each person, it is totally up to you whether you want to engage with it or ignore it. But I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't say ignore it to your own peril, because I'm just talking about data here. And so that's how this whole thing got started.
Yeah, what kind of, generally speaking, what kind of clients do you have, and like what industries are they in, and so forth?
Yeah, we don't have specialized industries. I do have some roots and connection to construction, but that's not a particular place where we're trying to stay or be all the time. We worked in manufacturing around construction products. We've worked with grocery store chains. There really isn't any industry that we don't go into. And the reason why is because our focus are on the timeless principles of leadership that apply no matter when, no matter where, and no matter who. And so we're industry agnostic. And even within the organization, whether you're talking about the C-suite or the front line, now most of our work begins at the C-suite and filters through the organization. But again, we talk about principles that apply regardless. Now, they get applied differently, of course, in the C-suite than they do in the front line, but the principles themselves are the same. So we don't have a specific industry that we're trying to focus on.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that lately. Where so I did a workshop for a church of all places. It was for their mostly volunteer leaders. There were a couple of people that were on staff, and I of course opened up by saying, "Hey, I don't usually come into the nonprofit space. The people that I'm usually working with are going to be for-profit organizations." And so, how about I make an exception for you guys? I'm gracing you with my presence here. Well, wouldn't you know it? During that, probably about halfway through that meeting, one of the volunteer leaders came up, and part of the reason why I did this is I realized that I could touch a lot of other workplaces through that
Yeah,
meeting, because at least 18 to 20 of the people that were
there you
there
have it.
had jobs somewhere
Yeah,
else.
yeah.
So, but one of the people that approached me came up to me and turns out worked for the government. Again, don't usually do work for government or nonprofits, but I thought, and this he approached me. He's like, I really need you to come talk to my operations
Mm.
team. Talk about this stuff. And so, it's wherever there are people, this kind of stuff's needed, right? Wherever there's people trying to
That's a
accomplish
great way
anything.
wherever there are people, that's a great way to say that.
So one of the things I really like about your book is the subtitle. I think obviously the title is great, but the subtitle really, I mean, if once people hear the subtitle, if they don't get the book, they're crazy. It's Why Some Leaders Succeed, Others Fail, and How the Quality of Our Lives Hang in the Balance. So give me a glimpse into that first part, the why some leaders succeed, because you begin the book by sharing the who, not what principle. Can you unpack that principle a little bit for me?
Certainly. And this is the core research that we talk about throughout the book and frankly throughout our work. So I was working with a leadership consulting practice of a firm, and we would bring people up onto the west side of Pikes Peak here in the US for a week at a time and put them through a number of assessments. And our clients began to ask, what's the magic mix? You guys see all kinds of leaders through here. What's the magic mix of personality and natural ability that's going to produce a better leader? And we had data. We had the ability to run that data. We had enough data that it was going to be a statistically significant. Well, if we found a correlation, we had enough. We had enough numbers that it was going to be a legitimate correlation, statistically speaking. And so we ran that initial analysis to try to answer their questions. And that was with 2,000 data points. A few years later, it got run again with over 20,000 data points. So we had multiplied our data points by 10. So we had plenty of data to draw some conclusions. And my colleague, Vanessa Kiley, she was the one with her fingers on the keyboard running the SPSS software. And what she found was not what we were expecting. We were looking for connections between personality, and I say natural ability. Let me clarify what I mean by that. Not natural leadership ability, but natural capability. So one of the things on that test, for example, it's called the Highlands, is if I show you a list of 15 numbers, you might remember 12 of the 15 and I might remember 3. That is back to kind of an innate ability. And so natural abilities is measured on those kinds of things. And so we were looking for correlations between those two assessments and a leadership 360 that we were giving. And what the software came back to us, it basically said, don't look at personality. There's nothing statistically significant there. Don't look at the natural ability. There's nothing statistically significant there. But if you look just within your leadership 360, you're measuring 8 areas of leadership. What you probably didn't know, the software said to us, is that just 2 of the 8 areas are responsible for 77% of the variability throughout the entire 360. And I had a similar look on my face to the one that you just had. I was like, what? Because I think our natural inclination, we're measuring 8 things. They're probably all relatively, all equally important. And what we found, if you think about a pizza, is that there were 2 slices of pizza that were way bigger than all the other slices combined. Fast forward 3 years, so let's save everybody some time. And when I share this next part, there might be some people that lose a little respect for me because they might say, it took you 3 years to figure this out. And I own it. I own it. It's one of those things sometimes where it's right in front of you and you don't see it for a while. But after 3 years of sitting with this data, I was in my office one day. I'd actually moved on from the consulting company. I wasn't working with them anymore. I should have been doing another part of my job at that time, but I was instead doing what I like to do, which was thinking about leadership. And I looked at my whiteboard and it just landed on me in that moment. I don't know why I hadn't seen it previous to that moment, but in that moment, I realized that those 2 big, huge slices of pizza that make up 77% of that circle of the total possibilities, they were different than the other 6. Those 2 were about who you are as a person. The other 6 were about what you do. And that's when my mentor worked down the hallway. I just about ran down the hallway and scribbled on his whiteboard as fast as I could. And I was like, wait, this is what this is saying. This is saying that 3/4 of our effectiveness as leaders comes from who we are, not what we do. And then comes the question for all of us, which is, how much work, really, am I doing on who I am? Because in the leadership world, that is often a very small number when we really break down what, the who that we're talking about. So that's how the who, not what principle was born. It was fresh out of data and continues to be based on that data to this day.
Wow. Yeah, and I can attest to that very thing. The fact that companies that are led very well, and you look at the leaders, it's not so much that there's a gap in skills. It's not that they know more or know how to do more. It's simply they have those, not necessarily personality, but as you said it, it's who they are at the end of the day. And a lot of them are very good at being able to, and I know you talk about this, you use this phrase in your book too, self-aware, and I've got it here somewhere behind me, I think, the John Maxwell book. Yeah, right here,
There
totally
it
not
is.
intentional that it's
Yep.
right there, but the self-aware leader. And what's interesting about this is that in recent years, I've almost felt like that's become a bit of a misnomer for a phrase, because I have found that when we think self-aware, it's like, okay, what do you like? What are you good
Mm,
at? What are your purposes? And that's part of it. But I think there's a whole other layer to self-awareness, which is um, how you affect other people. Like some people just are not aware of how what their actions do, how it very adversely affects other people. And so, but I will say that if I look at my career, the last 24, 25 years or whatever, if I look at who were the best leaders, the leaders who knew how their actions affected other people and how their behaviors affected other people, not just this is how I am. So like I said, there's sort of a double
yeah.
layer, two layers to that self awareness. Um, One of the other things you say that I'm sure as people read your book, they'll you'll get a big amen on this. But you talk in your book about how too much training focuses on the symptom, which are a person's
Yeah.
actions, instead of the root cause of bad leadership, which is the person himself or herself. In general, though, how do we develop training that addresses the person versus just the behavior?
Yeah. Well, one of the most important things is first is to acknowledge what this research says. So ultimately, it means we have to be willing to talk about who. And I think that's the biggest and first barrier. It's almost as if it's taboo to talk about who the person is. And I get where it can be uncomfortable and difficult. And the only place you attempt to have these conversations normally is with your kids. And they're a captive audience. So what are they going to do? They don't have a lot of recourse. But the reality is, if we can normalize the development of who we are in any organization, profit, nonprofit, academics, athletics, wherever, if we can normalize that, and I think that begins with us as leaders saying, I need work, on me. Like we can talk about you, and that'll be fine. But I am not a perfectly formed human being. It's really interesting because I don't run into people that say they're perfectly formed. In fact, I run into everybody says nobody's perfect. But what I find in that, and if my wife were on the call here, she'd probably say that I'm guilty of this as well. So, all of this applies to me too. Is that how often am I willing to follow up the phrase "I'm not perfect" with let me give you some specific and meaningful examples about where I've dropped the ball that's created damage or problems for other people. We don't usually go to that step. We usually say, you know what, I'm not perfect. I did wad up a piece of paper and throw it at the trash can today, and I missed. So that's at least I can say I'm imperfect like that. We don't get to the core of things like greed and selfishness and self-interest and insecurity and all these things, all these kind of rather ugly things that live to a certain extent in all of us. And hopefully we're growing and developing to move past these things. So I think the first and biggest barrier is that we have to be okay with talking about who. And that begins first with us as leaders doing the really hard thing. I mean, some people have an easier time than others, but for many people, beginning to acknowledge their own shortcomings that matter. Not the waste paper basket idea, but something that actually impacts others. Beginning to acknowledge that and saying, hey, because when the leader says, here are some things that I'm working on for myself right now. I'm working on, I think the one that's most taboo. Here's the thing that would just blow people away if you walked into your office or wherever you work and said this. I'm going to work on becoming a person of better character. I need to raise my level of integrity. I need to raise my level of honesty because implied in that, oh no, you mean that you are not the nth degree of integrity or honesty already? And the reality is when you begin to unpack ideas and the idea of who you are is so much bigger than these things, but I use these things because people are rather familiar with the idea. But when you really begin to dig into something like honesty, there's actually a lot more gray. We make it a black and white thing when we're 8 years old, but you get into adult life and there's a lot more gray about what does it look like to be a truly honest leader? What does that look like? Okay, when we get into the nuance of it, yeah, there is space for me to grow and develop. So I think we as leaders need to go first in engaging in this dialogue, and then we need to work to make it a common language. And hopefully, by exposing people to this research and this data, we can begin to open people up to say, hey, this just needs to be a normal conversation where we are all, as leaders, working to become more developed in who we are.
It's one of the things I love the most about your book is that it does get into the development side of things. In fact, um, you talk about the who of leadership, and you write it involves being two things primarily:
Yeah.
being others focused and inwardly sound. And you define in the book what it means to be inwardly sound. It's in chapter 5 of the book. So, what are some of the marks of an inwardly sound leader that people may not if you were to say, hey, tell me what inwardly sound is, it may not bubble up at the top.
Yeah, it's this is a great question because I love to put some teeth into this. I think the best analogy is to think about a seagoing vessel. So imagine you're in port and you're about to set out in a long journey out onto the open ocean. What are some things you're going to hope are true of your boat? You're going to hope that that thing is built really well. Because if you're going to be at sea for any amount of time at all, you can expect there are going to come some waves and some weather and some challenges. And so, what you want to know is that the structure of that hull, the materials themselves, are sound. The connectors and the fasteners that hold it together are not a little bit wiggly because it doesn't take a lot of wiggle when you're getting thrown around in the ocean to make bigger and bigger problems. You want to know that you are traveling out into the choppy waters of life and leadership with a leader who is sound, who you can count on, no matter the stressors or strains that are put on it. So that idea of a seagoing vessel to go out onto a long journey. I almost said holds a lot of water. That would have been too many analogies at the same time, but it resonates with the idea of we want to follow people who are that solid, who are grounded, that you can lean into when things are difficult. They don't have to, for the most part, worry about themselves falling apart because they have done the work to create within themselves a groundedness and a centeredness and a quality of integrity that you and I, as we follow those people, can hold on to. So that's what we talk about when we think about the idea of being inwardly sound.
Yeah, and what about just curious, what about the others focus part? Is there do you have an analogy for that one?
I don't know if I have an analogy, but I will say this: people tend to lead into that side a little more easily. Like inwardly sound, give me a little more others focused. Oh yeah, well I sure know what it likes to follow a leader who's self-interested, who's self-focused. I know what that looks like. we've had the opportunity to do that, so many of us, and it's really this combination of the two that is magical. Because ultimately, to be able to have done enough work within myself that I've grown and developed into a very mature, solid, grounded person, but then to not let the story continue to be about me. No, to take that groundedness and turn around and employ it on behalf of and for the sake of other people, which is to say, I'm pulling into my parking spot every day of the week for the sake of others, not just for the sake of my own interest, my own bank account, my own career, my own advancement, my own any number of different things. No, I'm here because I see the role as leader as one who serves and builds others up. And there's a lot of great content out in the world regarding serving or servant leadership. However, I think it's really difficult to push a button and say serve. I think there's many steps that come before that grow us into that capability. And so when we talk about being others focused, it's about all those pieces and parts that eventually enable me to be somebody who's there for others and not just for my own self, my own interest, my own enrichment.
Love it. One of the elements that you talk about in the book when it comes to being inwardly sound that really stood out to me is that the inwardly sound leader is secured and settled. Now, how does someone who can honestly assess themselves as not these things, not
Mm-hmm.
secure and settled, or one or the other, maybe they feel secure but they're not
Yeah.
settled. How do they become more secure and settled? Like, what does it take to get to that point?
Yeah. So if I could, I want to dig into those two words just a little bit and then we'll get to the answer to your question. So, secure, the word that many of us are familiar with that we hear more often is insecure. What does it mean to be insecure? It means somebody who's not comfortable in their own skin. It's often somebody who needs a lot of external validation of some sort or another. They usually have trouble going against the grain when they have to because there's a paranoia of some kind or another that causes me to feel like I'm not secure in myself. Settled, so that's a little bit more of my relationship with me. Settled has a little bit more to do with my relationship with the outside world. That is to say, am I relatively calm and centered about the fact that any number of things might happen out there over the next 12 to 18 months to 5 years to 10 years? And how do I think I'm going to fare given all those unknowns and challenges, whatever comes at me? And so, secure is about me being okay with myself. Settled is primarily about me being okay with whatever might come at me. And when you combine those two things, you can see how that would be such a pillar in this idea of being inwardly sound. So, coming back to your question, how do we work on that stuff? Well, let me just say out of the gate, there's no pill, there's no microwave oven to do this. This is hard work that almost always takes a meaningful amount of time. Because even when we do get some external validation that pops us up once in a while, that external validation usually leads to the need for additional external validation. It's not like somebody said, "Hey, you've done a great job," and that carries you for the next couple of decades. It doesn't work that way. So the validation is something that plays into our security, but it's never enough. And so, how can we work on these things? One of the key things we talk about in growing and becoming more secure and settled is how do we find the things that are unchangeable? How do we find the things that we can lean into that inform us about ourselves and inform us about that outside world that's coming at us that are unchangeable? And how do I make sure that I've got enough moorings into those unchangeable things so that when the challenges of life and leadership come at me, that I'm not so easily knocked off? And so there are methodologies, things you can walk through. A very simple idea is, and this is again, like this is, I wish I could say here comes the rocket science, but this is not rocket science, although it is difficult. One of the things we talk about with people around being secure and settled is oftentimes being in a deep quality relationship with somebody who brings no judgment towards you is a secure and settling place to be. We call that JFR, judgment free relationship. And I say to everybody, do you have a relationship in your life that's judgment free? Somebody that you could say anything to about what you're thinking or wrestling with. And it doesn't mean that they would necessarily agree with you, but they wouldn't lean into you with judgment, because judgment leads us back into that insecure place. If people are judging me all the time and I'm not yet settled in myself, then that can be a challenge. So we've got 11 different practices that we talk with people about how to become more secure and settled. Judgment-free relationships. JFR is one example of something to say, do I have a regular, I won't miss it, this is going to be a part of my life interaction in a judgment-free relationship? That is something that over time can help ground us to be more secure and settled leaders. I'll wrap up this monologue, and thanks for bearing with me here. Obviously, I get a little fired up about it. But my colleague and friend John Ott coined a phrase as we were working on secure and settled together that's better than anything that I could say. So I just repeat what he says. And he says that when you're secure and settled as a leader, you can accurately say, I'm okay, and come what may, I'm okay. That's the goal. That's where we're heading when we're trying to work to become more secure and settled, to be able to say, I'm okay, and come what may, I'm okay. And I think, I hope, I believe that anybody listening would be able to say, gosh, if that was true of me, I'd be a more effective leader. I can see where I would be a better leader. I wouldn't be distracted by what's everybody thinking about me, or am I going to get the next raise or the next promotion? I'm actually just settled and secure in myself. And so now I'm in a better place to make better decisions and to think more clearly. So that is in maybe not a tiny nutshell, but that is in a really big nutshell, that's secure and settled.
Love it. Are there any current or new leadership trends that you see nowadays that bother you? And if so, why?
Hmm. I don't know if you would call this a leadership trend. So I don't know if it's specific to leadership, but I do think it is a reality in our world that I mean, I know it's so easy and popular to bag on previous generations. That's just like a normal life sport. But we have something very unique that's coming up into the work ranks now, and that is these folks that are entering the workforce who have been completely raised on technology. I'm 52, so I'm old enough to remember. I mean, please don't turn off the podcast, but I remember when there wasn't an internet. There's a lot of people that don't have any idea. And as we enter the workforce, my concern, especially as technology has brought on social media, which has been able to do many amazing positive things. But one of the things that I think will challenge us from a leadership standpoint in the decades to come is a generation who has been invited to, hopefully they say no, but they've been invited to be the opposite of what we're talking about. They've been invited to be not inwardly sound and others focused. They've been invited to be, essentially not focused on the inner reality at all. And they become very wise at managing perception through social media. So unfortunately, they become outwardly focused and inwardly they're not only unsound, but they're not doing that hard work. And there's this idea of our old phrase, perception is reality. Perception's not reality, but to quote Jeff Henderson, perception is what people make decisions based on. And so we get duped into thinking that the social media story is the real story. And the reality is real life and real leadership in real relationships. It's not a social media game. It's actually real, if I could say that. And so I get a little concerned that we're going to have people that are extraordinarily capable at managing the perception of their personal brand, but are not doing the inner work within themselves to actually become truly inwardly sound and others focused leaders. So that's a concern that I have.
It's funny that you touch on younger people entering the workforce in your answer, because one of the questions I had to do with the leaders from younger generations. I mean, certainly there are plenty of millennial leaders, particularly in middle management, but we even see some emerging Gen Z leaders. Are there specific aspects of either inwardly sound, outwardly focused, or both that you see the younger leaders lacking more than some of the, like, are there some you're just like, oh, I don't know how they're going to get there because there's just no signs that they're going to achieve these elements of either being inwardly sound or outwardly focused? Any elements from those that you see the younger generations lacking
I
specifically?
don't think as you break down, we talk about 11 different things between those two things and that make up inwardly sound and others focused. I don't know if there's a particular one that feels like it's lacking. As I'm talking a moment ago about perspective and worldview, there's just a overall concern that we're professional perception managers and not doing the inner work. I will say this though, on the other side, there is one spot that I feel like I see repeatedly that gives us a little bit of hope in the other direction. And that is under inwardly sound, one of the things we talk about is being purposeful. And for a variety of different reasons, there seems to be a pull with younger leaders to be looking at a broader picture. And this obviously this is all in averages, and we all know people that don't adhere to the average. But there seems to be a little bit more focus on and interest in how am I investing my life? What am I spending this life on? What am I investing in? What kind of impact do I want to have? And yes, that can come around to where sometimes people feel like they should be promoted into major leadership roles after 6 months. But the positive side of it is I do think very different than say baby boomers who had the kind of the hangover from the Great Depression, which is basically just everybody be super thankful that you have a job and don't say anything because that's something that was a kind of hangover from the greatest generation before them. We don't have as much of that baggage, even though there's some other generational influences, but we see through perhaps I would say technology influence as well, a greater sense of wanting to have a meaningful purpose in work and in life. And I think that over time, if we hone that and we help them with that, that could become a real asset in that generation. So no specific out of in release on others focused. This is the one that I think that they're really falling short on, but I do see one that's got potential for us to lean into as we develop this next generation of leaders.
In chapter 11 of your book, you write leaders who are serious about helping their organizations reach their full potential must create leader development content and methods that embrace and address the reality of who, not what, which is the principle you talked about earlier. So, along those lines, what do you see? Not what I just read, but what do you see that most leaders and organizations are doing now instead of that?
Well, it gets back to something we were talking about a little bit earlier is are we having the conversation? I mean, under others focused, one of the qualities is humble. And I just, I get to do this for a living, but let's take the average leader that's sitting out there in an organization, and you've got up and coming leaders that you want to develop in the organization. My challenge, my question for you is how many conversations have you had with the people that you're leading about how humble they are and how they can work to become more humble? My observation is that's not a common conversation. And I want to help us make it a common conversation. It can be taboo to challenge somebody's character. Please challenge my character. Please challenge my character because it's going to influence how effectively I lead. So I think the number one thing, and perhaps a bit of a repeat of what I said earlier, is the number one thing as leaders in organizations is we have to be willing to be in those conversations. And I think that's the number one. Those are scary and difficult for most people. I think it's probably the number one reason why we don't have as much going on in this space as we could is because it's challenging, it's personal, it's not the normal conversation. But if you want to impact somebody's life, and I don't mean like today while you're leading them, if you want to impact somebody's life that will last long after they've left following you, if you engage in these kinds of conversations for their benefit, not for your own ego and not for holding your thumb on them, but if you invest in up and coming leaders by being willing to, with great genuineness and care, engage in these types of conversations, those folks will go down the road 10, 20, 30 years from now. They'll have their own families and their own companies. And if you're willing to do this kind of work with them, somebody down the road is going to say, who's the best leader that you've ever followed? And they are going to say your name because you were willing to invest in them and have these types of conversations. That's the opportunity that you have if you're a leader that's not fresh out of college. You get to help bring people along. And what an amazing legacy it would be to have somebody ask another person, who's the best leader you've ever followed? And your name comes to mind. There's very little in life that's better than that.
Agreed. So, Tim, what is next for you?
Well, part of it is what we're doing here today. Is part of it is just the continuing effort for people to know about who, not what, to know about what this research says. One of the things I've been amazed by over the years that we've been doing this is how not heads just nod. You ask people, it's kind of that thing where people they have known it their entire lives, but maybe we just didn't have the words for it. And so in that regard, back to the fact I'm a reporter, not an inventor. I'm not creating something here. I'm just reporting on something that's always been here. Once we give it language, once we put handles on it, now we can begin to do something about it. So what's next for me and for our organization is to continue to get this message out. Now, one of the things that we really love to do, we're not, primarily do, talks and workshops, but primarily we're walking with organizations over an extended period of time because we want to be in the battle with them. It's not like, hey, that's a nice talk. Good luck with that. I hope you figure it out. No, we want to walk with them to say, hey, back to the example from earlier. What does it mean to become more humble? How do we do that? we walk with leaders and organizations to go through that process. How can I become more secure and settled and help other leaders do the same? That's the conversations that we get the privilege to be in, and the process that we've been able to develop and hone over the last 11 years, and been really blessed to work with some amazing organizations that were willing to be in the conversation, and that made all the difference. So what's next for us is to continue to get the message out about this truth that people can leverage it, and then for the leaders and organizations that want help to walk, knee to knee, eyeball to eyeball with them as we dig into this reality.
Love it. Where can people find you and your work? What's the best place for people to connect with you?
Yeah, well, the book, The Only Leaders Worth Following, easiest place to find that is, of course, Amazon. So thank you, Jeff Bezos. So you can find us on Amazon. That's probably the easiest place to find The Only Leaders Worth Following. As far as our company, it's called the Aperio. You mentioned that earlier, but the thing that people will remember better than trying to spell that is you can find us at beworthfollowing.com, and that's the best place to find more about what we do and who we are.